The parking lot was empty, except for the small cluster of backpacks and water bottles strewn near the entrance of the cabin. 5 little faces looked up at me with wide eyes, a mix of curiosity and confusion that I immediately recognized. They were waiting for something I hadn't been told to expect. Or rather, waiting for someone who wouldn't come. I held my phone in my hand, the email still open. The words glared back at me. "We're going to Hawaii. Take care of our 5 kids." My sister's casual punctuation made it sound as though she had simply reminded me to water a plant. But this was not a plant. This was 5 tiny humans, some of them barely able to tie their own shoes. The initial shock didn't give way to panic. It gave way to a strange, heavy clarity. I counted heads, checked each backpack, and tried to find the nearest familiar object, a jacket, a snack, a drawing. Something to anchor me. "Where's everyone else?" one of the younger ones asked, voice hesitant. "They went on a trip," I said, keeping my tone calm, though the tension in my chest coiled tight. I had no idea how long they expected me to manage this, or why. For the first few minutes, I moved mechanically, unpacking bags, distributing snacks, and tying shoes that had long since escaped laces. I watched as confusion slowly melted into routine. They took cues from me. They didn't ask why. They just waited. I remembered all the times in my family that responsibilities were assumed rather than asked for. I remembered the dinners I'd hosted, the errands I'd run, the last-minute favors that came with no acknowledgement. Patterns of over-reliance, entitlement disguised as need. And now this. I wouldn't be complicit in what was clearly abandonment. My calm, reflective exterior belied the tightening knot inside. I couldn't simply fill the gap and let this continue, or pretend that this was acceptable. So I did what felt necessary. I called Child Protective Services. I explained the situation, emphasizing safety, not vengeance. I stayed on the line while an intake worker asked questions, verifying ages, details, and confirming that someone would arrive to assess the situation formally. The children responded to my presence differently after that. Some were relieved, some confused, some anxious. Their responses mirrored the complexity of the moment. They needed someone responsible, yes, but they also deserved boundaries and clarity. And finally, someone was providing it. By the time the authorities arrived, I was tired but steady. CPS professionals took over with practice calm, talking to the children, checking identification, and explaining next steps. I gave them the details I had, answered questions honestly, and allowed them to assume control where I could not. When my sister and parents returned from Hawaii, they were expecting a casual scene, kids laughing, bags unpacked, tension eased. Instead, they were met by the uniformed officers who calmly but firmly explained the situation. The authorities shifted instantly from them to the professionals, and, quietly, to me. I didn't know. My sister started, face red, tone defensive. "You knew?" I said simply, letting the words hang. "You made a choice." They looked around at the children, at the authorities, and then back at me. For the first time, I saw hesitation, surprise, the faint recognition that the rules had changed, that their casual expectation of my compliance had been disrupted, that they couldn't simply leave and assume I would absorb the fallout. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the stark reality that boundaries had been set and enforced. They would have to reckon with them, not with my anger, but with undeniable consequence. I felt a mixture of relief, guilt, and lingering frustration. Relief because the children were safe. Guilt because I knew the situation could be interpreted as extreme, as a breach of familial trust. Frustration because the underlying entitlement had not vanished, it had only been interrupted. As the officers guided the children away to temporary care and assessment, I realized that my role in the family had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the default caregiver, the one expected to absorb chaos and responsibility without consultation. That shift was quiet, procedural, but it was palpable. My sister attempted to argue, to justify, to appeal to our parents. But they too were caught in the sudden recognition of limits they had previously ignored, assuming that time or affection could be leveraged to bypass accountability. I remained calm, detached almost, but with a quiet inner resolve. The control I had regained was not aggressive. It wasn't punitive. It was a sober confirmation that responsibility must be assumed consciously, not imposed arbitrarily. Hours later, after the situation had been documented and the children were safely placed with temporary guardians, I returned to my home. The quiet was absolute. I sat at my kitchen table and reflected on the cascade of events. The authority intervention had changed the trajectory, not just for my sister and parents, but for myself. I had drawn a line. I had enforced it. There would be conversations, explanations, and probably resentment in the weeks to come. Relationships would be strained, potentially irreparably. But the psychological space I reclaimed, the confirmation that my obligations weren't my own to define, was steady, undeniable. Some things remained unresolved: my sister's sense of entitlement, my parents' complicity, the subtle tension that would linger at family gatherings if they ever occurred again. And yet, a certain clarity had emerged. I had learned, definitively, that familial obligation is a choice, not an automatic inheritance. That responsibility can be enforced externally when boundaries are ignored. And that sometimes ensuring safety and fairness requires uncomfortable decisions, even when they disrupt long-standing dynamics. The house remained quiet after I settled in. The sun set over the horizon. Outside, life continued as usual. Inside, there was calm, a reflection of the boundary finally respected, and a recognition that control, once ceded without question, could be quietly and responsibly reclaimed.